The class library project type in C# is probably the most important project type in C#. Every other project relies on a series of class libraries. But with it being so foundational, it's often overlooked. In this video, we're going to look at what the class library is, how to use it in various projects, and how to get the most benefit out of it. Now, if you don't know me, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. I do that by providing videos here on YouTube multiple times per week, plus I have a weekly podcast. I also provide courses on C#, web development, and much more at IamTimCorey.com. The profits from those sales are what pays for the free content here on YouTube so that everyone can have a great education in C#, not just those who can afford it. Now, in this video, as with most of my videos, I'm going to create some source code. If you want to copy that source code, use the link in the description. All right, let's jump over to Visual Studio and let's get started with the class library project. So we'll say new project, and I could just jump in and use class library. Notice it's at the top of my list because I use it quite frequently. But let's do this instead. Let's search. Notice my settings, I have C# as my language, but everything else is standard. Let's search for class library. And a number of different options come up. So we have just class library, and that is the one you'll use most often. This is going to be the .NET 6 or whatever version of .NET you have library. That's the standard one you'll use for all new projects. So it's kind of like the generic one, the one that is most useful. But there are other specialized libraries available. For example, the Razor class library is for just the Blazor type stuff. And then, I'm sorry, not Blazor. It's for Razor Pages stuff, which is ASP.NET Core. So you can use it for that. And that's going to be UI specific class library. So it'll be for user interfaces, not for just code. It'll be UI specific code. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And on the theme of UI specific, we have a WPF class library. So again, this is more targeted towards a user interface library, and a class library for Universal Windows, or UWP, again, for that UI library. And then we have class library for .NET Framework. And this has been a confusion point that's gotten better over time since we have gotten further and further away from .NET Framework. But there was a time when the class library project was just called class library, and it was .NET Framework. And then we had a time where we had the class library project that was .NET Core that said .NET Core. We had one that said .NET Framework. We had one that said .NET Standard. And we had all these different types. And now we have, again, the generic one that comes up is the .NET Core, the .NET, which is still .NET Core, but we just dropped the core off the name. So now it's .NET 6 or .NET 5 or .NET 7, whatever version you want. But we still have the .NET Framework version. So if you want to work with a .NET Framework user interface, so let's just say you have a .NET Framework 4.7.2 application. Well, it's a WinForm application. You've got this user interface, and you decide after watching this video that you want to create class libraries to support it. Well, since you have your user interface in the .NET Framework, you should probably create your class library in the .NET Framework as well, because the two have to match. So if you're using a .NET Core project, then you'd use the original class library, which is a .NET Core project type. So we want to match those up one-to-one. There is an exception for that, and that's a .NET Standard, which we'll see in a little bit. I'll talk more about that in a minute. We have the Android, iOS, Android. These are, again, user interface specific. And WinForms or Windows Forms, Android binding, iOS binding, again, user interface specific. And then more user interface specific. But there is a .NET Standard class library. Nope. So they've changed it again. It used to be that when you said class library, like I said, it would be in parentheses. You'd say .NET Framework, .NET Core, or .NET Standard. Now when you select this, if I hit next here, well, we'll do it in a minute. But when you hit next, you can do a .NET or .NET Standard. So you have the option of either. So remember I said that if you got a .NET Framework user interface and you want to use a .NET Framework class library, the exception to that rule would be if you're looking to upgrade your user interface over to .NET. So if you want to upgrade it into the modern version of .NET, well, then you would probably create your class library as a .NET Standard 2.0 class library. That way you could still use it with the .NET Framework, but then you can also use it with a .NET Core project. It's kind of a bridge project. I do have a video covering .NET Standard on this channel. You can go and look more about that. But there's a lot of different options here. We're going to focus today primarily on the class library. So a .NET Standard or .NET version of the class library, the generic one. The user interface specific ones are just mainly there to add additional things to make them more useful to the user interfaces. But you could use just a generic library too. So we're going to start with the class library, the one that you will use almost exclusively. We hit next, and let's give us a name. So we'll say demo library. I like to name my class libraries with the name library at the end. And the reason why is because when you add a reference in your user interface to your class library, you don't want to add a reference to another user interface. You want to make sure you get the right library to add a reference to. And we'll see that. So by saying library at the end, you know that's the thing you want to reference because that's a class library. So that's my personal opinion. You do not have to follow that. It's not an industry standard thing. That's just a thing that I do. Okay, so let's put this in my temp folder and we'll call this demo app. We hit next. And here you get to choose. And notice we have .NET Standard 2.0 and 2.1. And again, if you're working with .NET Framework and wanting to upgrade to .NET Core, you'd want to choose .NET Standard 2.0, not 2.1. 2.1 does not support .NET Framework. So again, I have a whole video on .NET Standard. We're not going to cover that in depth here, but I do want to point that out. The higher number does not mean better. So I have the option of .NET Core 3.1, which is long-term support, or LTS, .NET 5, which is out of support, and .NET 6, which is the new long-term support. So .NET Core 3.1, I believe that goes out of support in December of 2022. So there's a just over 3-year cycle for the LTS or long-term support versions, and a 15-month support window for the I forget they call it the other versions, the versions that are just they're for the people who want to upgrade all the time and get the latest features all the time, and not for businesses who want that long-term support and that longer period of time to support a version. So definitely fine to still use this, but I would upgrade to .NET 6 if you can. But we're going to start in .NET 6. That's the latest version, the one we're going to use. We'll hit create. And notice it is supported by Android, Linux, Mac. It's a cross-platform project type. So you can use this class library on pretty much any platform because it is .NET version 6. Okay, so right out of the gate, this is the class library. We have our namespace. We have our class 1 as our default. The reason why we have our class 1 here is because when you were to add this as a reference somewhere else, it needs to have some type of class already in there. Otherwise, the namespace does not exist. So that's why we have class 1. I hate class 1. I wish it wasn't here. I wish they would just start with nothing. But I do realize the reason why they did it this way is because if you don't have a class in the namespace, then the namespace does not exist. So that's why I did it that way. Now, Just so we're clear here, a class library project on its own does not run. You cannot just hit the play button. In fact, if we do that, we're going to get this message. Pay attention to this message. Don't just skip over it. I want you to actually look at what it says. It says, a project with an output type of class library cannot be started directly. Okay, so when you see this message, that means you've got the wrong project started. If you're trying to run a class library, then you've made a mistake. That's not what you do with a class library. You do not execute it directly. So if you see this error message, that means you need to change which project is the startup project. You want to have a user interface project of some kind. So whether that's a console app, a WinForm app, WPF, ASP.NET Core, MVC, Razor Pages, Blazor Server, Blazor WebAssembly, whatever the user interface is that you choose, you want to have that as a startup project, not your class library. So let's talk about what is a class library. Why do we have class libraries? Well, class libraries have a number of different purposes. I'm going to share those purposes up front. We'll see some of them in action, some of them I'm not going to demo, but I'd love to know if you want to see demos of some of these other things. So one of the big things that class libraries allow us to do is reuse code. So if I create code in here, and we're going to do this, we're going to create a little bit of code in here. If I create code in here that is some type of value add for my application, if I put it in here in a class library, I can have multiple user interfaces call this library and use the same exact code. Now, what benefit does that have? Well, by doing so, I am conforming to dry. Don't repeat yourself. Now, there's a limit there. You have to be very careful to walk a line. Dry is not dry should not hurt you. It should only help you. So if it's starting to hurt you, then stop doing it. Repeat yourself. But if there is a case where maybe you have some logic, for example, for me, a big repetition is data access logic. If I'm accessing a SQL database, well, that code is pretty much the same for every one of my projects. So I put in a class library and just reference that library. So what is a library? It really is what it sounds like it is, a library. It's a repository where we can ask for code, ask for methods, and say, hey, give me this method. We use this all the time in .NET. So if I have I'm just going to put it inside class 1 for now. We're going to delete class 1 in a minute. But public void run me. And I were to say console.writeLine. Now, we're not in a console application. This is a class library. But let's just say that the caller of this was a class library application. Well, then this right here, console WriteLine, this is a method. This is a class. Where did it come from? It came from a library. Microsoft has created a bunch of libraries that we can use. And in fact, we can add more. If I were to right-click on Dependencies and say Manage NuGet Packages and go to Browse, well, there's a lot of NuGet packages that will show up in this list. So Entity Framework for SQL. I've got Newtonsoft.json. I've got System.text.json, mock. Not all these are from Microsoft, but these are all libraries. These help me do different things. So by adding one of these things, Serilog is a great one. That's a logging tool. Well, it's a library. And they have written a bunch of code in a class library and then given it to us to use. And then I can just say, install this, and then execute or call those library methods whenever I want. Well, that's code reuse. That is not repeating ourselves. We create the library once, or someone does, and then we reference that library over and over and over again. Microsoft has broken out .NET Core into a bunch of smaller libraries, so we don't have to have every library built into .NET Core. In .NET Framework, we had a massive framework because everything was built in, or a lot of it was. With .NET Core, Microsoft said, hey, we're going to break that apart into smaller libraries. And then we're not going to include everything in .NET Core. We'll have NuGet packages. And then if you want, for example, Entity Framework Core, well, then you can install that NuGet package. And then if you want to work with SQL with Entity Framework Core, you'll install that NuGet package, which is a NuGet package is just a wrapper around a class library. So we use libraries for every single application we build. Let's see how we can build our own application in just a minute. But that's one reason we use class libraries is for that code reuse. But there is another thing that is really beneficial about the class library is that it allows us to disconnect our business logic, our data access from our user interface code. Now, again, you have to make sure that this is not a hard and fast rule, but more of a best practice or a guidance. And that is that you can separate out your user interface from your business logic and data access and other types of code like that. The benefit there is that we can upgrade our class library separate from our user interface. We can also create a different user interface and call that same class library. That's the code reuse part. But we've got code reuse is a big thing with class libraries, being able to be disconnected from a user interface. You can upgrade one, but not the other. And then there's the idea of organization. We can put our similar code in a similar library. We can have multiple libraries. This allows us to organize our code in a way that's logical. With small applications, we should probably only have one library. But with larger business applications, we may have 4, 5, 6, 10, 15 libraries, depending on how large the application gets. This allows us to independently work on these class libraries, to have them grouped by logical thing. Maybe one is for SQL data access, maybe one's for MongoDB data access, maybe one's for certain business logic, whatever the case may be. So that's another use for class libraries. And another one that is used occasionally, it's not as big of a use, but it is something that's really fun to do and really nice to do in certain circumstances. And that is it allows us to create plugins for our application. We can create an application, a user interface that has certain hooks in it. And it can load DLLs, which are class libraries compiled. It can load them and add that code to the user interface dynamically using what's called a plugin system. We do this all the time with Visual Studio. Notice extensions up here? What do you think that is? That's libraries that we add new code to Visual Studio. So if we come here to manage extensions, there's a bunch of extensions that are installed. GitHub Copilot is currently installed. They haven't turned off, but for this demo at least, I'll turn it on a little bit. But we have Live Share. We have all these other extensions for our Visual Studio. These extend or add value and functionality to our user interface. Well, that's done through class libraries. So the class library is useful for a lot of different scenarios. So let's talk about how do you build a class library, what is a class library, and so on. So you've already seen we can't run this directly, but let's open up. Let's go to Open Folder in File Explorer, and we'll go to the bin debug.NET 6. And in here, we'll see that we have the demo library.dll. This is the class library. This is what it gets compiled to. Normally, when you compile a user interface that's a, let's say, WPF project, it would be an exe project if you're on Windows, which WPF has to be. So that's a executable file that can be run directly. A DLL is a dynamic link library. If you look on Windows, you'll find that Windows has a lot of DLLs that it uses for various purposes. Well, the DLL for our library here is the file that gets created. Now, the PDB and the JSON file, those are separate and they're different. They're support files. But the DLL file is our code. It's our library. But it's not useful in that state. We can't execute this library. So what do we do to the library? Well, we add it to a user interface. So let's first create a class. Let's delete this one. Let's create a new one. And we're going to create a class. It's getting simple stuff. We're not going to do, real code and data access and all the rest. We may do that in a future video. But for this, we're just going to do simple code. So we're going to say, let's do a person processor. And I'm going to get rid of all of my using statements. I'm going to change to file scope namespaces. So I put my semicolon here, and what that does is it saves me 4 spaces. If you undo this, notice how everything's indented 4 spaces or whatever the tab stop is here for you. But it's all indented because it's inside of these curly braces. So with that doesn't really add a whole lot of value. If you don't have more than one namespace, then why are we indenting everything inside that namespace? So if we use the file scoped namespace, by putting a semicolon here, it takes those curly braces away. Everything's over on the left-hand side. So now we've saved 4 spaces for every single line in the entire file. There's just a little bit of horizontal space reclamation. I personally prefer it. Let's make this public. And we're going to create a public, let's do a public string. And we're going to say join name, string first name, string last name. Okay. And this method, really simple stuff we're going to do here. It's going to return first name plus space plus last name. Okay. So that's just going to join those two together and create a full name or something like that. So again, this is not rocket science. This is not something you would need to write down, make sure you take notes on, because this is just a demo to show off what we can do with the class library. So I have my code here, and this is something we do. Let's just pretend this is something we do in a lot of our different applications. We always have a first name and last name, but we need some way of joining them. Now, obviously, again, this is a demo, but let's just pretend this is some kind of logic that we do in a lot of our different applications. Well, we can put it in our class library. Now, let's right-click on our solution and say add, and let's create a new, right-click, add new project. There we go. And we're going to say a console app. That's a user interface. So console UI like so. And again, .NET 6, which matches our class library. And we can get rid of this. Actually, let's get rid of all of it. There we go. And now what we're going to do, notice we run this. It doesn't run because we're still setting demo library as a startup project. The first project always is the startup. We can change that by this little drop down here. Oops, not that one. Yes, this one. Nope. Okay. Sometimes, I'm not sure why it's not showing up. Sometimes it shows the other project type. You can just select it. But you can right click on console UI and set a startup project. There we go. So now that we have that, we can run this, which is not going to do much. There's build errors. Program does not contain a static main method. There's no code in here, basically. Console write line, hello world. So you run this now, it will run. It's going to give us this hello world and then exit the application. Not exactly a amazing application. But let's just say we had, well, let's do this. Console.write, what is your first name, colon space. And we're going to say string first name equals console.readline. And we'll do the same thing with last name. And it's yelling at us because this is a nullable string. So let's mark it nullable. And what is your last name? And then we're going to do that join and then say your full name is. But we could put that code. We have, this complicated logic. We could put that complicated logic in every user interface, but maybe we use it over and over again. So we're going to put it in this class library. But how do you reference it over here? Well, we right-click on Dependencies of the console user interface, and we say we want to add a project reference and select Demo Library. This is where that naming convention comes in. Remember I said that I like to name my class libraries with a library at the end? That way we know which project to select. Now, there's only one right now because I'm in one referencing another one. Therefore, there's only one in the list I can reference. But we're going to see coming up soon that we'll have multiple options. You do not want to reference the other direction. So your class library should not know about your user interface. Your user interface should know about your class library. That's the direction it goes, which means the code in here should not talk to the user interface directly, because then it knows about your user interface. Now, there are some user interface specific libraries. We saw those, like the WPF library and the Razor Pages library and so on, where you can do user interface stuff or user interface code in there because it's a user interface library. It's a little different. That's specific to a type of user interface. But in this case, the generic library, you don't want it to know about anything to do with the user interface. So I'm not going to do a console write line here because of the fact that I might not have a console in every user interface. Instead, I return that name and then allow the console to write it to the line. So in program.cs, I need to add a using. That's demo library. That will allow me to say string full name equals, and it's person processor. Oh, I need to mark it static. Let's not worry about instantiation. Person processor dot join name and first and last name. So you're going to join those two names, and because these are potentially nullable. So let's mark these as nullable, and like so. So now we have a full name, and I can say console write line string interpolation. Your full name is full name, like so. Again, not exactly a rocket science type application, but this should give us a working application. What's your first name? Tim. Last name is Corey. Your full name is Tim Corey. Cool. That works. Okay. But what value did the class library add? Now, let's pause right here. Let's not think about other user interfaces yet. Let's talk about what value the class library has added so far. Well, the class library is doing non-user interface specific code. Personally, and this is a personal preference, but I'll talk about why it's, I think, of value. Personally, I like to move every bit of code possible out of the user interface and into a class library. Now, in some cases, that's just moving it because it allows me to kind of just move things out and keep this user interface as small as possible. So this is user interface specific code. Asking for their name, capturing that name. Asking for the last name, capturing that name. And then the code that is not user interface specific, we call out and give it the information it needs and say, hey, do that work, and give me the results. And then we, again, do user interface specific stuff. So the user interface specific stuff is done in the user interface, but everything else is done in the class library. If you did not have any other plans to reuse the library, I think this is still valuable because let's say I want to upgrade the console user interface. Maybe I want to change how it works. Well, the console code is simpler. It's just the console code. So let's say Microsoft comes up with a new version of console or the new way of doing console write lines. Well, we can just change the user interface specific stuff in the console and not worry about all the code. We don't have 1,000, 2,000 lines of code in here that some of it's business logic, some of it's data access, some of it's user interface. It's not all mixed together in one big ball of spaghetti. Instead, we have our separation here. That allows me to do work on just the user interface specific stuff. Let's just say that down the road, my boss comes to me and says, that console, it's not real pretty. We want to upgrade to a different user interface. Well, if I have separated out my console code from my non-console or non-user interface code, then I just have to change the console project. I don't have to change the project and the business logic and the data access. If you have it all mixed together like one big bowl of spaghetti, well, then it makes it much more difficult to upgrade that user interface or change that user interface. I know of a lot of situations. I have been through so many where people said, it's just easiest to put it all in the user interface. And then down the road, they said, we'd love to go to the web. We got this desktop application. We'd love to be on the web, but we just can't. It's just too complicated to extract out and replace just the user interface specific code because it's essentially rewriting your entire application. But when you have moved most of it to a class library, well, that library can work with a new user interface. You don't have to redo all your user interface code and all your business logic and all your data access and all the rest of the code you have. You just have to replace your user interface code. So that makes for a much easier transition. So even if you only have one user interface, I highly recommend you use a class library for everything that's not user interface specific. Now, are you gaining any other benefits by doing that? Probably not. That's probably the only benefit you get is that separation where you can upgrade one and still have the other one support that new version. So you can replace console UI with WinForm UI or WPF UI, and it makes for an easier upgrade process. But you also have some organizational benefits, so you can kind of organize things a little better. But besides that, that's maybe it. Maybe you don't have any other code reuse. Maybe you're not calling this method more than from just your one user interface, and that's okay. You're still getting benefit out of it. But let's just say that you do decide we need a new user interface. So you right-click on the solution, and you say add, and we're going to say, just for the sake of this demo to make it faster, we're going to say WinForm app. And we're going to say WinForm UI and .NET 6. And now I have this new fancy user interface that allows for drag and drop building whenever it loads. So this application, let's make a couple of tweaks here right away. Let's change, immediately the font size has to change. 9 point is ridiculous. Let's change this for demo purposes to 22. And now you do that, it makes the form extra big. Shrink it back down. Okay. I'm not going to make a pretty beautiful form. I'm going to make something that works. Okay. So let's create, let's get our toolbox here. Wait for it to load. It's been a while since I used WinForms, so it's probably buried in the back of my hard drive. But what we're going to do is we're going to use this WinForm UI to replace our console user interface. So instead of having the console ask us what's your first name, what's your last name, we're going to use just fields. So we're going to grab a label, and let's pin the properties here. And we're going to, again, do this really quick. So first name, I want to name this really. First name, and let's grab a text box. And we'll align that up with the text and make it a little bigger. And we'll call this text box first name text. And we'll copy these things and paste them. Wait for it to load. The new WinForm designer is a little slow. I have noticed that. So let's call this last name. And I'm getting a little bit, I really hate doing things this quick on demo. For example, I'm not naming these. So this is label 2. This is label 1. I don't like doing that, but for demo purposes, it is what it is. It's just the fastest way I can do things. Whoops. Last name text. Okay. And then we'll have a button. Sounds good. And we'll call this the combine name. And oops, under here, text, we're going to say combine name. Double click it. And in here, let's make our file scope namespace. In here, we can, in its method, we can call our same method from our class library. But again, we have to right-click on dependencies, add project reference, and here's where that library naming convention comes into play. Because I could reference my console UI, but that's not right. I want to reference my demo library. So I click OK. And now I can add my using up here, using demo library. And I can say in here, I think it's message box. It's been a while. .show. And the message is going to be, I'll create a variable for it. String message equals, or actually full name. And I'll say person processor dot join name, and we're going to say first name text dot text. That's the actual. This is the text box. This is the value of it. And then last name text dot text. And then we'll say string. Let's get this almost on the screen here. String, we're going to say message equals string interpolation. And let's grab that same, let's grab something similar to this. Well, let's just do the same thing. Be lazy. There you go. Same kind of message, and we'll just show that. So when you click the button, it's going to pop up a message box that says, here's your full name. Now, I'm still allowing the class library to do the work, and I'm just doing user interface code here. And this just makes my user interface code a little cleaner. Instead of, I could put this right in here. That'd work too. So in fact, you know what? Let's just do that because it's not that much different. We don't need to allocate another string. So with that, we now have our user interface code in here, but we're still reusing now that class library. So if we were to run this, we have to go back over here to run it. We have to right-click on WinForm UI and say set as startup project. And let's run this. And we get a Windows form. We can say Tim, Corey, combined name. It says your full name is Tim Corey. So it's the same code. We have reused all that complicated logic we have in the join name method, but we reuse all that logic in a new user interface very, very quickly and easily. So this allows us to switch between user interfaces. The really cool thing is that it doesn't have to be the same style of user interface. So we've got two different desktop apps. Well, I could add a Blazor server project and reference the same demo library and call the same code. This is something that really gets people confused sometimes. When they watch me create demos, for example, with data access, where I'll create a little class library that has SQL data access, and it talks to SQL database, it gets data in, data out, all the rest, and I call it from a user interface. Let's say Blazor server. People will ask me, well, how would you do that same user interface or that same data access with Windows Forms? Well, guess what? It's the same class library, the same way. So whatever code you can put in a .NET 6 class library, you can reference from just about any user interface. And I say just about because there are some limitations or exceptions. The biggest one is going to be Blazor WebAssembly because it fully lives on the client side. And so your class library has to be fully client-side ready code. So usually data access can't be done from client side, therefore you couldn't call that class library. But anything server side, anything desktop, console, those kind of things, services, they can all use the class library directly. The other limitation is Blazor MAUI or Blazor Hybrid or .NET MAUI, because both of those are they are desktop applications and they can use some desktop DLLs, but the mobile versions can't. So you couldn't use it for the entire application because mobile can't have direct data access either. But it can access other class library stuff. So if you had class libraries like this, where you're doing string manipulation, yeah, you can reference that from a MAUI project, not a problem. So it's just, it depends on the type of code that's in the class library for certain project types. And I call those out when I work through those project types. But for most project types, a class library can be used across them. So a SQL data access class library can be called by Blazor Server, by ASP.NET Core MVC, ASP.NET Core Razor Pages, ASP.NET Core API, WPF, WinForms, UWP, WinUI 3, console, worker service. The list goes on of the different places that can call and use that data access library. So even the more restricted types, most of them can use it. So gRPC can also use it. So that class library is super helpful. Notice that I haven't redone this code. The code is still in one place. I've been able to call this class library and build a new user interface that supports the same class library, same business logic, same data access code, same whatever. And I just built the new user interface. When I'm ready, I can replace the console UI with the WinForm UI. And I was just replacing the user interface, not the entire application. So yeah, no, the user interface is not the entire application, or it shouldn't be. You should have the ability to separate out your business logic, data access, and so on, and just have UI code. So that's a really useful tool, is if you put your code into a class library, then you can make your upgrade process for your user interface or the change process much easier. Let's just say that you want to have both user interfaces. No problem. You can still do that, and you can still build out this class library with more and more things to support both user interfaces. I have found this very helpful when doing things like maybe a desktop application or something similar, but I also want to have an API. Maybe I'll have a Blazor server application. So I have Blazor server, cool, but what if I wanted to support a mobile application? Well, I'd want an API. I want that API to have access to pretty much the same stuff that the Blazor server user interface does. Well, if I put everything in a class library, the API can call it and the Blazor server can call it. That way, I can have two different project types and then support even more through my API, but they can both use that class library. I have centralized most of my code, and it's just the user interface that's different. And the user interface really is a small part of your overall application. Yes, I know a lot of work can go into your user interface. A lot of time and effort goes into making it look good and adding the right controls in the right spot. But it's really, besides making it look good, it's the data access and the business logic, and all that code should be in a class library, not in the UI. So that's the benefit of a class library. We haven't even touched on the fact that we can use a NuGet package. And I've talked about it, but how did that actually work? Well, right now, both of these projects reference the demo library directly. But what if I wanted to create a new user interface project in a different part of my system? Maybe it's not in the same solution. How do I reference the same demo library? Well, we could create a reference to this demo library and have it just be on a different spot in the disk, and that could work, but it gets a little messy. Or I could, just so you know, I could take the DLL. Remember not terminal. If we look at the bin debug.s6, we have that demo library.dll. I could take this and just copy just the DLL and put it in a different folder and reference that DLL. So that's possible too. That's not ideal, but it's possible. So I could copy this and put it into the console UI and say in the bin directory debug, I can just paste in demo library, which notice it's already there because the reference actually makes it copy the DLL over. So I can manually do that. I could copy it other places, but then what happens when you have different versions of your DLL, where maybe you copy the latest version of your DLL over to a project, get started, you build the project up. In the meantime, demo library has changed. How do you get the new version? Well, you copy the output DLL over to the other project, update the reference. Well, what if you haven't done that in a while? It's kind of scary, right? Because what if things have changed? What if we change the logic of join name? It might break my new application. So maybe I don't want to use that version. Well, now I've got to figure out which version of that DLL is it, because it's the same name. So I have to figure out, is this version 1 or version 2 or version 2.5? What version is this? And that gets kind of messy. And that's where NuGet packages come in. Because if you've done C# for a while, you've probably used NuGet packages. NuGet packages are the way to get these libraries, and they're a way to track the version you're using and even use a specific version. You don't have to use the latest version of a NuGet package. Let's right-click on Dependencies on our demo library, go to Manage NuGet Packages, and let's just say this is going to be our data access. So we're going to select Dapper. Well, notice the latest stable version is 2.0.123. But I could roll back and say, I actually want 1.60.6. I can select that version and install it. So whatever version I wanted that's still available, I can select. So I can even go back to the version 1.0 of Dapper. Now, is that the right call? Probably not. But when I'm on an older project, it may have used 1.6, and there was some breaking changes when we went to 2.0. So maybe I'd stick to 1.60.6 for a while and use that version, and that's okay. But that allows me to choose which version of the DLL to use. And instead of manually copying a DLL, we use NuGet to download it for us. And yes, this downloads DLLs and puts it into our project. So that's how we deal with sharing libraries in a way that is easy to use even internally. So you can have your own internal NuGet feed. Notice this package source up here. Right now, this is the public NuGet.org, but you could add to your feed. You could come here and say, I want a new feed, and you could put in the URL or file location for your packages. So if you have a private package feed, you could put that here and search that one as well. So that's how we share libraries between projects. If you're just building it for one project, you just right-click and say, reference this, which we've done here. So it said add project reference. We've chosen the demo library. That's great. But if you're going to use it quite a few times, if you're going to use it inside of an organization, you probably want to wrap it up in a NuGet package. And that way you can version it. You can have different versions for different projects. And you can make sure that you have it in one spot with all your logic, have that dry, don't repeat yourself, build the logic once, and then reuse it as many times as you want throughout your organization. We've talked about dependencies, but I do want to point out how this works. So when you build just a demo library, it creates that DLL. When you build just a console UI, if it didn't have any references, it builds just an executable file. But what if you have a console UI that has a dependency on demo library? Well, what happens is it first goes out and says, what are my dependencies? And it says, oh, I depend on demo library.csproj. Okay, that's a dependency, that's this reference. So it says, okay, before I can build out my executable file for the console, what I'm going to do is build out the demo library. So it builds a demo library, gets the DLL from the bin directory, it copies it over to the bin directory for the console project, and says, okay, I have the library, now I can build the console project, which depends on that library. And then it builds the console project. Why is this important to know? Well, what if I went to my demo library, went to references, add project reference, and selected console UI? Maybe I say, you know what? I think my class library needs to know about the console. And I select this and I hit OK. And it says, a reference to console UI could not be added. Adding this project as a reference would cause a circular dependency. Why is that a problem? Well, because remember how the build process works. Console UI says I depend on demo library. So build demo library first and then give me the DLL. Then I can build. But what happens if demo library says I depend on console UI? So build that first and give me the exe. Well, if I come back up here to console UI and says, no, I depend on demo library. And demo library says, no, I depend on console UI. Neither one can get built because they both depend on the other one first. So that's why we can't have a two-way dependency. We wouldn't want that anyway. And here's why. If you decide that your code must know about the user interface project, in this case, console UI, if it must know and have a reference to console UI, guess what? You have console UI code in the wrong spot. That's console UI code, and it should be in the console UI project. If it has to access the console UI project, it needs to be in the console UI project. So if your library code needs to have access to the console, first of all, ask yourself, does it really? But if it really does, then you need to put it in the console because you got it in the wrong spot. It shouldn't be in the library. It's not adding value in the library, and it's just put in the wrong spot. So your class library should not know about the user interface. And the reason why is because of the fact that right now we started off with console UI calling this method. But what if this method, instead of returning a first name, what if it did console writeline first name space last name? Well, then we create the WinForm user interface and we come here to the code and we say, I want to put that in the message box. And it goes, no, I'm going to do a console writeline. Well, what does a console writeline do for form 1? Nothing. In fact, let's comment this out and let's take the same code and do a console writeline here instead. Imagine this is what's being called in our class library. Well, if I run this and I say, Tim, Corey, combine name. Cool. It's done. But nothing happened, seemingly. It did if you're actually running Visual Studio, because you can go to the, output window. And I believe it's in here somewhere, buried. But it's in one of these windows. But you shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be using your console for a WinForm project, because the WinForm project is supposed to show stuff to the user, and there is no console that's being shown to the user. So this demo library shouldn't be talking to the console, shouldn't know the console, because it's not always going to talk to the console. Instead, sometimes it'll talk to the console, like in console UI, but sometimes it'll be talking to the message box in the WinForm project. Or maybe it'll be talking to the web page in MVC or in Razor Pages. So your user interface, your class library, unless it's a user interface specific class library, should not know about the user interface at all. And even if it's a user interface specific class library, it shouldn't know about the specific user interface. So even if I had a WinForm specific user interface library, so it can have WinForm code in it, it should not know about WinForm UI. It should just know that it can talk to Windows Forms and have Windows Forms code in it. That's all it should know about, because the whole point of a class library is to be able to call it from a different project. So if it is tied directly to WinForm UI only, well, then it should be in WinForm UI. That's where it should be. So that's how to use a class library. That's how to use or create the DLL. You can use a DLL just directly by using a project reference like we've seen here. You can also copy the DLL if you really wanted to. You can then right-click on dependencies and say it's under, I haven't noticed in a long time. I think it's shared project. Browse right here. So you can browse and say browse and then look for a DLL, which of course these are like blend DLLs, but you look for your DLL and reference it that way directly. Don't do that because that just creates a mess. If you decide you want to have that DLL go around to different projects and not be in the same solution, well, then you want to create a NuGet package and have a NuGet package feed for yourself. Then you can reference it from a bunch of different projects by saying manage NuGet packages. That way, it's very, very easy to reference, very easy to version, very easy to update those versions. It just saves you a whole lot of headaches to do it that way. And then finally, DLLs can be, or class libraries, can be used for things like plugins for other applications. So really useful stuff there as well. I won't get into how to do that specifically. If you want to see a plugin video, go to the suggestion page, the suggestions.iamtimcorey.com. I believe there's already a plugin suggestion there. Go upvote it. Let me know if you want to see that. But this is the class library project type. And again, this is so useful for so many different projects. I highly recommend that once you've learned the basics of C#, then I would recommend you get into learning about the class library project type. This is the second project type you learn in the C# master class or master course. So in the C# master course, we start off with a console project because it is a user interface. It does make life easier for getting information and learning C# code, but we're not using it as a user interface to learn the UI. We're learning it as a user interface to call C# code that we're learning. We focus in on C# code, and for the first, a few dozen lessons, we only focus on C# code itself and not user interface specific code. We just use a console UI because it's the quickest and easiest. But then as soon as you start learning other project types, the very next project type you learn is the class library because it's that important. You should almost always be using a class library with your projects. It is that important. I do think that at the very least, you separate out your non-UI code into a class library. So with that, if you have any questions, let me know down in the comments. I do want to point out that this is an intro to class libraries, and here's where it fits in the overall hierarchy. I've created this csharpprojects.com website that shows you where things fit in their categories. So desktop, web, service, and other, we've got class library. This is where this fits, but it is, like I said, probably the most important project type to learn. It's the second one you should learn. It's the one right behind console just because that's how you can call C# code easily. But class library, notice the coming soon video, that'll be replaced with this video as soon as it's up. But it's important to know this, but then once you know this, well, then it can be called by pretty much any one of these project types. So pretty much anything else can call a class library. So worker servers can, console can, API, Razor Pages, MVC, Blazor Server, Blazor WebAssembly, gRPC, Azure Functions. They can all call class libraries. WinForms, WPF, UWP, .NET, MAUI, Blazor, Hybrid, Console. They can all talk to the class library. And yes, I have console in more than one spot, and that's intentional. But that's where it fits in the hierarchy. It's a it's not a project that you build on its own. Usually you build this project in support of another project. In fact, you always build it in support of something else. So the class library seems like it's kind of like this, little thing that maybe I'll learn it someday. No. Learn this first, use it first, and then use it with all these other project types. Okay, so that's where it fits in the hierarchy. I encourage you to use this tool to, now that you know this, now you can pick what to learn next and say, okay, I know how to use a class library. I've practiced it. I've tried it a few times. Now I want to integrate it into the UI I'm already using, or maybe I'll learn a new UI but then also use that same class library. So with that, that's the class library project. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments. I'll try to get to as many as possible. I can't get to all of them, but I'll try to get to as many as possible. Thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.